Welcome to the seventh and final video in this series on the externalist theory of Portalism. In this video, I make the case for the plausibility of Portalism and illustrate how it meets the challenges and questions that inhere upon all theories of consciousness. Portalism holds that the horizon of consciousness is a fundamental force of nature, ontologically irreducible, and the medium of subjective experience. Portalism is biocentric, consciousness being inherent in all living organisms across the zone of life. The means of accessing consciousness is manifested as different combinations of biological and/or biochemical constructs, which I refer to as the portal. In any organism where a functional portal is present, access to consciousness is immediate, involuntary, invariable, and autogenic, and remains so until the portal is closed by damage, disease, anesthesia, or death. The portal's access to consciousness creates an individualized localization within the all-encompassing horizon of consciousness, actualized as mind. As such, the locus of mind is in the world, external to the res extensa. A subjective realm exists, as does a physical realm that exists beyond our perception of it. Mind is the subjective realm, tethered to and existentially codependent upon the res extensa, and when the body dies, the portal closes and the mind dissolves. Consciousness is subjective, and in itself not bound by space or time, but mind, with its relationship of bodily codependency, becomes pinned in space and time through its portal connection to the body. To encounter objects and states of affairs, the mind is dependent upon the body's ability to move through the world of objects, while the body is dependent upon the mind to find those things in the world necessary to sustain it, such as food, water, shelter, and a mate. Without mind, the body cannot navigate its reality, nor can it survive unassisted. Causal pathways are bidirectional. The mind has agency, directing its body in navigating the world, while the brain maintains homeostatic equilibrium, categorizes and stores memories, communicates egocentric needs to the mind, processes sensory data and discloses it to mind, and establishes intellectual limitations. The mind is the agent, not the brain, and the subjective realm is non-deterministic. The I is possessed of free will and is therefore wholly responsible for its choices. The self manifests as reflexive consciousness, as self-awareness, within an entirely subjective realm, purely mental, independent of sensory modalities, and unbound by time and space. I will now begin to address the traditional problems inherent in dualist theories of consciousness in an attempt to justify Portalism based upon its explanatory power. I will begin by explaining Portalism's response to the hard problem of consciousness. David Chalmers' definition of the hard problem is as follows. The hard problem of consciousness is that of explaining how and why physical processes give rise to phenomenal consciousness. A solution to the hard problem would involve an account of the relation between physical processes and consciousness, explaining on the basis of natural principles how and why it is that physical processes are associated with states of experience. Dr. Chalmers supplies four possible forms of explanation that might meet this challenge. They are the reductive explanation, which would involve purely physical principles with no appeal to consciousness. The materialist solution, in which consciousness is a physical process. The non-materialist solution, wherein consciousness is non-physical. And the non-reductive solution, in which consciousness becomes an integral part of the explanation. Given these selections to choose from, the answerable forms that Portalism would correspond to are options 3 and 4. Portalism assumes a non-physical subjective realm in addition to an objective reality, and so is a non-materialist solution, while it is at the same time non-reductive, the horizon of consciousness being established as an irreducible fundamental force of nature and the ontological ground of subjective experience, and therefore qualifies as an integral part of the explanation. Now returning to the original challenge and regarding the question pertaining to how and why physical processes give rise to phenomenal consciousness, if it is true that the locus of mind is outside of the body, then the answer from phenomenal externalism is that they don't. Consciousness, as a fundamental force of nature, always already is, and being ontologically irreducible, it therefore cannot rise from anything, as doing so would contradict that irreducibility. Many of the difficulties associated with consciousness stem from the presupposition that the mind is the brain. Phenomenal externalism invalidates these problems by denying their premise. This does not mean that the brain and nervous system, at least in humans and higher animals, is not an important and necessary element in portalism. It absolutely is, but not in the way that physicalism holds that it must be. Given that gravity and consciousness are both irreducible fundamental forces of nature, and both phenomena occur autogenically, it would follow that anything with mass has gravity, and anything with a portal has consciousness. In all living things, mind is actualized as an individual localization within the horizon of consciousness, manifested via the portal connection. The mind is external to the res extensa, and therefore must have its locus in the world. As the world is the medium of reality and consciousness is the necessary condition for the subjective experience of that reality, a de facto relationship of identity between mind and world manifests. As mind, we do not look out upon some external reality, observing and encountering things that are not us. Truly, each of us as mind is absorbed into world through our being in. So in effect, the world is something that we as mind already are. Heidegger frames this concept best in his book Being and Time, wherein world is ontologically not a determination of those things which Dasein essentially is not, but rather a characteristic of Dasein itself. In portalism, the external mind is absorbed into world such that a relationship of de facto identity is established. This identity collapses the distinction between subject and object, with the result that the struggle between the knower and the known synthesize in becoming a single unity. I exist only as consciousness, and my consciousness is tethered to my body through its portal mechanism. As my body is an object in the physical world, it is pinned in time and space, which in turn pins me as mind also in time and space. As the body moves about in the world, I as mind encounter objects and states of affairs within my perceptual field disclosed to mind via my body's sense modalities. And because as mind I am being in the world, these encounters are consciously intentional and concurrently manifest as phenomenal content, enabled by the singularity of a mind-world totality actualized by the mind's being in. I believe that this account of experience meets Dr. Chalmers's requirement for being explanatorily fundamental. As far as cognitive mechanics are concerned, if, as portalism claims, there exists a relationship of de facto identity between mind and world, then the perception is the experience, and world is exactly as it appears. If perception is experience, then there is no gap to explain. And if there is no gap, then there is nothing to bridge. This is portalism's response to the problem of the explanatory gap and the necessary bridging principles that it implies. The problem of other minds is a problem of epistemology. Although it is my intention with my theory to leave cognitive and epistemic issues to others while focusing upon the nature of consciousness, this particular problem must be at least cursorily addressed by any theory of mind, if for no other reason than tradition calls for it. The problem is stated as this. Given that outward behavior is all that I can observe in others, how can I know that other minds exist? Due to the nature of subjectivity, I can only report my experience in the first person, wherein the experiences of others, if they even exist, can only be revealed to me from the third person, like that of a narrative story. So in light of this fact, how can I be absolutely certain that my own mind is not the only mind that there is? Portalism's response to the problem of other minds is quite simple. Assuming that radical subjective idealism is false and that a physical universe exists outside of our perception of it, then as I can sense their presence with all 5 of my sense modalities, I am justified in the belief that other human beings exist. Since I have a body and a mind, and I can perceive that other humans have bodies similar to mine, then I have a reasonable expectation in the belief that other bodies also have minds. As consciousness is ubiquitous and available at all times and in all places, the existence of a functional portal is the necessary and sufficient condition to the actualization of mind. Given a functional portal, individual actualizations of mind are immediate, involuntary, autogenic, and invariable within the realm of living things. Given this, there can be no question as to whether or not other minds exist, as given any functional portal mechanism, consciousness becomes the default state for all living systems. Therefore, ipso facto, other minds must exist if portalism is true. To be sure, when any organism is possessed of a functional portal, the mind cannot not exist. Just as the problem of other minds diverts us into epistemology, the binding problems of consciousness point us toward cognitive neuroscience. There are 2 separate problems that qualify under this heading. The segregation problem, or BP1, asks how brains can take complex patterns of sensory input and break it down into discrete elements. The combination problem, BP2, is the problem of how objects, background, and abstract or emotional features get combined into a single experience. Although in many cases the 2 problems overlap, strictly speaking, BP1 seems to be entirely within the realm of neuroscience. The very description of the problem presupposes mind-brain identity and embraces the analytic tradition of reduction, seeking to distill comprehensive sensory input into discrete objects, in the search for neural correlates and the identification of the different parts of the brain and central nervous system that are responsible for processing the isolated components of a gestalt perception. In addition to the mind-brain identity assumption, the methodology in many responses to BP1 are framed in the terminology used by those who still assert that through sensory perception, the brain uses the incoming data to create an ideation of the external reality it perceives, which it can then operate upon. Many philosophers of mind simply reject this idea, claiming that consciousness is not unified to begin with, and thus no binding problem exists. The combination problem BP2 is more interesting. The crux of the issue involves the problem of how brain mechanisms construct the phenomenal object. How do data from sounds, sights, and smells combine in the brain to create the phenomenal experience of sitting outside a cafe enjoying a coffee with my girlfriend? The answer is that they don't. Portalism is phenomenal externalism. As the mind is in and of the world, so is phenomenal experience. The identity relationship is between mind and world, not mind and brain. The brain does receive and filter sensory input, but it cannot assign a meaning or context necessary for an understanding, and it cannot determine the object of intentional focus without causal direction from mind. Neuroscience can publish pages about the neuron firings, acetylcholine neurotransmissions, distributed neural connections, and color images of brain activity, and all of it is valuable in its proper context. But none of it is evidence of the experience itself, the feeling of something like there is to be experiencing an object or state of affairs in the world, and only mind can assign meaning and context to that experience because only mind is capable of cognition. The brain, being cranially embodied, can never experience the world, unlike the external mind, which is in and of the world. Experience is not what a brain does, it's what a mind does. Binding problems only present difficulties for materialists that continue to embrace the mind-brain dogma. If the mind is the brain, if mind truly rises from some unknown arrangement of matter, then exactly how objects, background, and emotional features are combined into a single holistic experience must be accounted for. Portalism holds that the external mind always already is being in the world. and that phenomenal experience manifests autogenically from the de facto relationship of identity between mind and world. If portalism is true, then there is no premise for binding problems. The next challenge that any dualist theory must answer is the argument from brain damage. This argument holds that whenever some manner of brain damage is sustained, whether it be by disease, automobile accident, drug abuse, etc., it is always the case that the mental substance and/or properties of that person are significantly changed or compromised. It is reasoned that if the mind were separate from the brain, as dualism holds, how could it be possible for it to be injured whenever the brain is injured? In fact, it is often the case where the character and extent of such injuries to the mind, as in the case of stroke, are predictable, and therefore dualism is false and the mind is the brain. In cases of dualism where the mind is embodied, as it is with Cartesian cranialism, this argument can present quite the challenge for a dualist to respond to, but portalism, being an externalist theory, is entirely compatible with it. Damage to the brain may affect the intellectual limits of certain areas in the brain, simultaneously reducing or increasing the capacity of the portal mechanism and making it more or less efficient, as I have previously described, but it can never directly impact the mind. The all-encompassing horizon of consciousness being constant and the mind being an individualized location ontologically grounded in that horizon, only the quality and capacity of the portal mechanism is subject to impact by damage or disease, that affectation being manifested in the reduction or enhancement of the phenomenal content and cognitive possibilities of any particular localization of consciousness. Brain portal damage impacts the content of consciousness, never the nature of consciousness. Therefore, if viewed functionally, portalism would be compatible with the premise that brain damage invariably, albeit indirectly, affects the mind, while at the same time rejecting the presupposition that the mind is the brain. The final challenge to dualism that I will discuss in this video is the argument from simplicity. This argument should not be confused with Occam's razor, an issue which I will address a little further on. Instead, the argument from simplicity appeals to heuristic technique. Basically, the question for the dualist amounts to why have two ontologically distinct entities when it would be so much easier to explain consciousness in terms of only one? In other words, why unnecessarily complicate matters by insisting that the mind is not the brain? There are several problems with the heuristic approach as it is defined in this way. True, one is simpler than two unless one is unable to sufficiently explain the problem, where in this case subjective experience is the problem waiting to be explained. A similar argument might be to claim that 4 tires on a car are overly complicated when one will do, but one won't do, and neither will mind-brain identity theories that struggle to explain how subjective experience rises from physical matter. Heuristic strategies derive from previous experience with similar problems, but there is nothing similar to consciousness. There are no pre-established methodologies to employ in our search for the nature of subjective experience. In terms of an argument from simplicity, one could claim that the explanatory power of having 2 ontologically unique substances at least answers some questions, wherein the heuristically simple solution of only having one explains nothing at all. In regards to portalism, in view of the argument from simplicity, the concept of a portal into the horizon of consciousness manifesting as an actualization of mind, establishing a de facto relationship of identity with the world through its being in, is arguably much simpler than the pursuit of complex neurological correlates to discrete mental states, while at the same time being possessed of far greater explanatory power. Thus I would hold that portalism is in itself an argument from simplicity. Traditionally, there remain 2 additional arguments against dualism that must be addressed. They are the argument from neuroscience and the argument from causal interaction. As I address the issue of dual path causality, at least fundamentally, in video 6 of this series, I shall not repeat it here. As for the argument from neuroscience, the reply from portalism is too lengthy and technical to reproduce in a short video format. So I will remind the viewer that all of these arguments are addressed in much more detail and in much broader context in the book, Portalism, and externalist theory of consciousness. So I will use the time remaining in this video to describe the explanatory power of Portalism and make the final case for its plausibility. Portalism is a dualism in that it fully recognizes that both mental and physical states exist. Although it is not a traditional dualism, by holding that mind is external to the res extensa, it is nevertheless dualistic in terms of the substance debate, and therefore is a theory in direct contradiction to monist materialism. At this point, it is necessary to divide materialist theories into those that absolutely reject that mental states exist, and those that seek some accommodation for the phenomenon of subjective experience. I refer to the former as being eliminative materialism and illusionism, adherents of which tend to be immovable physicalists, ready to absolutely deny that mental states exist, while at the same time offering no alternative explanation for the undeniable sensation of subjective experience. These theories hold that nothing non-physical exists, and that the experiences of qualia and intentionality, while intuitive, are no more than illusionary misrepresentations of physical processes. As these radical forms of materialism leave us with little to discuss as we go forward examining the conflict between monist materialism and contemporary dualism, we shall do so by discarding eliminative materialism and illusionism as irrelevant positions within the bounds of this discussion. The central issue amounts to this. The physicalist, holding that the mind is the brain, must account for how mental states emerge from physical matter, and how a gray blob of organic matter in the skull accomplishes experience. For the dualist, including the phenomenal externalist, it falls to them to explain the causal interrelationships between the physical and the mental. Such is the mind-body problem. But this famous problem applies to all theories of consciousness, monist and dualist alike. Keep in mind that what we are evaluating here is which theory, between mind-brain identity and Portalism's phenomenal externalism, offers us the greatest explanatory power. For the physicalists, this problem has recently taken on a new manifestation as science and philosophy merge into the discipline of neurophilosophy, wherein the most recent areas of research include neuroscience and the search for the physical correlates of consciousness. It is a desperate search, and the stakes are frighteningly high, for if physical correlates of conscious experience cannot be mapped and/or explained, then mind-brain identity is false, which by extension makes materialism false. Here it is important to remember earlier how the original mind-brain identity theorists claimed Occam's razor, the sheer simplicity of the single substance concept, the elegance of a single physical universe. Occam's razor is a common abductive heuristic used by science that can operate equally well in the defense of theories of consciousness. Those that claim that Occam's razor holds between any two theories the simplest one will always be the best fall victim to a common misunderstanding. The fact being that the razor applies only when the two theories are of equal explanatory power. When such is the case, the simpler of the two will always be the best. But this definition also allows for one theory to elevate above the other through the enhancement of its explanatory power, even if by doing so it becomes more complex. Therefore, the decision metric in Occam's razor lies not in a given theory's simplicity, but in its explanatory power. And it is by this metric that I will show the plausibility of Portalism to be as good as any and better than most theories of consciousness. For instance, one could make the argument that the elements of mind-brain identity theory have now themselves become victims of complexity, as evidenced by a profusion of distributed neural pathways, monosynaptic reflexes, C-fiber firings, reentrant neural loops, axons, synapses, excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters, etc. These concepts being only the thin end of the neuroscientific wedge employed in the search for the physical correlates of consciousness. Still, in the light of all of this intense research and the participation of a lot of very smart men and women, the fact remains that we are no closer to any real understanding of the nature of a thought, or of the feeling one has when their son hits a home run. Yet this is not my point. In lieu of all this scientific research based upon the assumption of mind-brain identity, research which I still believe is valuable in its own right, my question here is simple. What happened to the original claim of Occam's razor? Apparently, this simplicity and elegance of single-substance mind-brain identity theory has gone out the window. If compared to the external mind-world concept of Portalism, which theory now has the stronger claim to simplicity? I believe Portalism has not only the stronger claim to simplicity and elegance, but also to overall explanatory power. So in terms of explanatory power, how do mind-brain identity theories measure up? Physicalism is seductively intuitive. To many of us, it feels as though we, as mind, are sitting behind our eyes, observing the world as some external reality, guiding our bodies through it, observing and encountering those things that are not us, sensing the world through our sensory modalities which convey our perceptions to our brain, which assigns meaning and context to those perceptions. In other words, our understanding of the world is in our heads. What we consider to be our consciousness, our mind, is actually only our brain, which not only experiences the external world, but is also able to think about that world and the objects in it. Additionally, the brain is also able to turn these thoughts inward and to think about itself as itself. If mind-brain identities are true, then only beings with brains can have consciousness, as without a brain you can't do any of these tasks previously ascribed to the brain. Yet many living things successfully navigate their realities, find nourishment, propagate, exist in perfect equilibrium with the universe, yet have no brain. Functionalism would solve this by holding that a brain is not necessary. What is required is only a thing that possesses the functionality of a brain. Such a thing would overcome the problems of neural chauvinism and multiple realizability, but it still leaves us with the question as to why consciousness should be so selective under physicalism. Other physicalist theories extend themselves in the admission that mental states do exist, but that they are somehow supervenient on the brain, reliant upon the brain for the emergence of mind, but that mind never being determined by the brain. All physicalist theories, perhaps with the exception of anomalous monism, agree that in no case can a mental event ever cause a physical event, the universe being causally closed and all of its energy accounted for. This is indicative of attempting to account for subjective states within the boundaries of physical laws, these limitations being placed upon subjectivity not by consciousness but by science. For physicalists, the truth about what we understand to be subjective experience, the something like there is to be experiencing of an object or state of affairs in the world, is only an illusion. The reality being that these feelings, emotions, and intentions are in fact neural processes that correlate to conscious phenomena. The fact is that a brain is a miracle of biology and biochemistry and brilliantly adapted to its role of managing the physical body. But to go further by describing this complex organ as the origin and locus of consciousness amounts to magic, as there's no evidence that this is the case. Dissect the brain down to the atomic level and you will never find the color red, the smell of coffee, the touch of a lover, or the feeling of grief at the loss of something beloved. And most significantly, you will never find a thought. Neuroimagery represents the last hope of physicalism in proving its mind-brain assumptions, but images of brain activity have never been proved to be images of cognition. The brain activity they portray may in some cases be correlative to a thought, but they do not cause the thought, neither are they the thought. In over 150 years since the inception of logical positivism, mind-brain identity has been the presupposition behind the overwhelming majority of scientific attempts to account for subjective experience, and in all this time, no materialist theory has ever been able to explain qualia or intentionality. The tools of neuroimaging are only the latest iteration in the attempt to account for subjective experience using objective definition, struggling with the search for evidence to fit within a predetermined theory predicated upon a false presupposition that the mind is the brain and that consciousness is in the skull. To this day, there has never been any empirical evidence to support the idea that the locus of the mind is in the brain. Given this, it should be clear that mind-brain identity theories have little, if any, power to explain the nature of consciousness. Just think about it for a moment. If the mind is in the brain and the brain is in the head, how can it experience the world? If this is the case, what would the relationship, if any, be between the knower and the known? If mind is the brain, then we could never truly experience the world, it being an external reality removed from mental contact. We would only know the world as ideated images collected by the senses, processed by our brains into what we understand to be experience, while the exact mechanisms by which all of this occurs remains unexplained. Portalism is so much simpler, while at the same time able to explain so much more. But unlike physicalism, portalism is unorthodox and counterintuitive, and to understand it will require a mind open to new explanations. Throughout this work, I have been resistant in straying into the cognitive and epistemological aspects commonly addressed by other theorists. To this end, I have limited my arguments to address the nature of consciousness as phenomenon. As such, I am prepared to accept any explanations of cognition as well as epistemological ideas that might be advanced by cognitive scientists and neuropsychologists, because the ultimate validity of such explanations is independent of the locus of consciousness. Whether mind-brain identity is the case or portalism is true, explanations concerning cognition will work or not work equally, as they depend only upon the existence of a mind and not upon its locus. The explanatory power of portalism is self-evident. As consciousness is a fundamental force of nature, mind is absorbed by the world, resulting in a de facto relationship of identity wherein subject and object synthesize into a singularity of phenomenal experience. This is how portalism answers the mind-body problem. Its explanatory power is further strengthened by its biocentrism, extending consciousness to all biological systems across the zone of life, an ability to account for how all living organisms, animal, plant, and protist, are able to navigate widely disparate realities. Portalism embraces multiple realizability and escapes neural chauvinism in placing the necessary prerequisite for consciousness upon the portal mechanism, which may or may not be a brain. Portalism accounts for the problem of other minds while rejecting skepticism, solipsism, pantheism, and panpsychism. It answers all of the traditional arguments against dualism and demonstrates compatibility with the ideas of several brilliant contemporary thinkers, both dualist and physicalist. In addition, portalism denies the false dichotomy of analytic versus continental philosophy, embracing ideas from both traditions, rejecting dogma while placing emphasis upon what works. Unlike physicalism, if the 6 assumptions of portalism are true, there is nothing that remains to be explained or accounted for. The mind is not the brain. The mind is in the world. As a final argument for plausibility, I claim that portalism meets and even exceeds the requirements of Occam's razor by virtue of its simplicity and elegance. I have shown that the explanatory power of portalism significantly exceeds that of mind-brain identity theory, emergentism, epiphenomenalism, and supervenient physicalism. It is not nearly chauvinistic, and it is compatible with multiple realizability and functionalism. It has an answer to the hard problem, the problem of other minds, and each of the traditional arguments against dualism. No other Cartesian, property dualist, or materialist theory can make similar claims. In making the case for portalism, from the perspective of continental rationalism and contemporary dualism, I have used the only tools available to me, those being synthetic a priori propositions, arguments from analogy, and abductive reasoning in defending my theory. But these tools cannot deductively or empirically prove its truth. Inductive arguments can never be sound, because the truth of the premises cannot be determined from experience. But such is the nature of subjectivity. and by extension of all things metaphysical. If we assume that the assumptions of Portalism are true, those premises being that consciousness is a fundamental force of nature, that portals enabling access into this horizon inhere in all biological systems, and that any presence of a functional port, no matter how unsophisticated, autogenically manifests an individual localization of consciousness actualized as mind, then it becomes justifiable to believe that the conclusion, being that the locus of mind is in the world and accounts for subjective experience through a de facto relationship of identity with the world, therein becoming world, is probably true. Given this, the argument for Portalism is cogent, meaning that as a theory of consciousness, it is plausible, and plausibility is the best I can do given the metaphysical environment that I must operate in. I believe that I have adequately demonstrated the plausibility of Portalism through its explanatory power, its elegance and simplicity, its arguments appealing to a priori powers of reasoning, its premises being reasonable, and the truth of its conclusion sufficiently persuasive. These are the criteria of the cogent argument. I therefore submit that Portalism, a radical phenomenal externalist theory of consciousness, is possible, likely, and justified. And to my viewers, fans, and critics alike, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching this series of videos on the theory of Portalism. It is my hope that you were able to approach this somewhat radical, unorthodox concept of consciousness with an open mind, and that although you may not agree with my theory, at least you have an understanding of it. If that is the case, then I am certainly happy with the outcome. As no plausible metaphysical theory of mine can be proved or disproved, understanding is the best I can hope for. If you're interested in learning more about Portalism, my book, Portalism and Externalist Theory of Consciousness, should be available for pre-order in the spring of 2022, with the ebook appearing on most bookseller sites soon after, and the print version available in the fall of the year. Right now, you can visit the book's website for more information and updates regarding the release of the book. Again, thank you for watching.